basically rheumatic fevers are most common in kids because they have more exposure to upper respiratory tract infections. At least now what we are seeing is that it is caused due to a sedentary lifestyle and lack of a good food habit, lack of exercise. Previous intake of alcohol, smoking can increase the chances of gout.
What are some tips to prevent arthritis?
So, good amount of sleep, about 6 to 8 hours of good continuous sleep, night sleep, timely food, good balanced diet is an absolute requirement.
What are the tests used to determine the rheumatic diseases?
So commonly when we see a patient initially, we get all the basic tests done, which is hemograms, their liver and kidney function test and everything. But the most important indicator is what are called as inflammatory markers. So these are ESR and CRP.
Which is the best diet for a patient having rheumatology?
The best thing is to switch to vegetarian ever, I think, because it's very rich in antioxidants and vitamins and minerals. I wouldn't shy away from fish also. So fish has a lot of DHAs, a lot of omegas. Eggs are a great source of protein, so egg whites are great.
Welcoming you all to today's poster show. Today with us we have Dr. Ashwini, who's a rheumatologist, and we shall know more about arthritis, gout, and let's get started. Welcoming you, doctor.
Hi.
First of all, who is a rheumatologist and what conditions are treated?
So this is a very good question and probably the best one to start our podcast with. So a rheumatologist is someone who deals with most common rheumatological conditions and autoimmune diseases. So autoimmune diseases are the ones where our own immunity is attacking various parts of our body. Now, since the most commonly attacked organ in the body is the joint, which causes arthritis, so rheumatologists and arthritis doctors have kind of become synonymous, but we deal with autoimmune diseases of any part of the body which is there. So I think the most commonest one that we deal with in India is definitely rheumatoid arthritis, where it goes in for joints, basically small joints more than large joints. Then there are many seronegative arthritis such as spondyloarthropathy, psoriatic arthritis, and then there is ulcerative colitis related arthritis or reactive diseases. Then there are some things called connective tissue disorders, under which comes lupus, scleroderma, Sjogren's, mixed connective tissue disorders, many things, muscle diseases like myositis. And then when they go for isolatedly some parts of the body, some people have only autoimmune disease of the eye, so where they can come with recurrent inflammation of one of the layers of the eye, so that causes iritis or uveitis, which may be related to arthritis. So these conditions, based on which organ is involved, is classified or individually, are the ones that we commonly treat. So any rheumatologist is the one who deals with any kind of autoimmune disorder, diagnoses it, evaluates it, starts the treatment, and then monitors the treatment and modifies the treatment for the betterment in the long term.
What is a rheumatic fever and where is it more common, in kids or in adults?
So basically rheumatic fevers are most common in kids because they have more exposure to upper respiratory tract infections. So there is a kind of an organism called Streptococcus. So when this organism infects any person, most commonly it is kids, but can infect adults also. Sometimes the protein that is in the body, the immunity produces a lot of antigens and antibodies against the antigens against that particular bacteria. So sometimes what happens is the immune gets a little dysregulated and it attacks the body itself, which causes rheumatic fever. So rheumatic fever can have like carditis, can have arthritis, can have skin lesions, etc. But this is in the first onset, it is generally treated by either a physician or a pediatrician, but only if there is further involvement of the heart. So normally we say rheumatic fever licks the joint and bites the heart. So it may look that the joints are like painful and swollen and stuff, but the heart is what we are most worried about, and that needs real treatment, because if we delay in treating that, it attacks the valves of the heart, causing what is called as mitral stenosis. It can like reduce the aperture of the mitral valve and can cause many problems. So these can be avoided by timely diagnosis and treatment, but it is generally not seen by rheumatologists. However, we do get it referred to us, because commonly when people are investigated, they do these ASO titers, through which if it is very high, there is a indication that this might be rheumatic fever. It's not diagnostic, but it can give you a clue. So when that happens, sometimes people are just said, oh, you have vata, and they are sent to us. So we have to differentiate between rheumatological autoimmune diseases versus rheumatic fever, which is mostly a cross, antibody antigen reaction between the infection and the immune system.
Coming to arthritis, what is arthritis?
So like I said, any autoimmune arthritis is just inflammation of the joints. So in rheumatology, arthritis generally means autoimmune involvement of inflammation of joints. So arthritis can also occur with other conditions, like you might have heard of osteoarthritis, which is predominantly a degenerative condition. You might have heard of gouty arthritis, which is predominantly a metabolic condition. Then you might have heard of hemophilic arthropathy, which is patients who have hemophilia and have recurrent bleeds in their joints can develop one kind of arthropathy. Then there are arthritis that can be related to many infections. So most commonly you would have heard of chikungunya, so where the virus itself causes arthritis, pain, fever, extreme, it's called breakbone disease, because it causes that much of intense pain. So it's called that, and later on it can transfer to becoming a chronic arthritis like rheumatoid. So although any involvement of the joint in terms of inflammation is called arthritis, the ones that we commonly deal with are the ones which are under the autoimmune category. So arthritis can be, say, large joint arthritis, which is predominantly the large joints of our body. That can be shoulder, elbow, hip, knee and ankle. And then there can be small joint arthritis, which can be like the fingers, toes, wrist, all these things. Sometimes there is involvement of the temporomandibular joint also, which is this jaw bone. So wherever there are joints, there can be arthritis. So there is involvement of the spine as well, which can cause spondylitis. So all these in an umbrella term is called arthritis.
What's the difference between arthritis and rheumatic arthritis?
So I think you're asking about osteoarthritis and rheumatoid arthritis. So osteoarthritis is predominantly a disease of degeneration. So as we age and as our bone health progresses, so because of wear and tear and various stresses, if there has been lack of exercise as well, that adds to it, trauma adds to it, family history can add to it. So all these factors together cause what is called as erosion of the cartilage and the bone, and development of what are called as osteophytes. These are like bony growths that are outside of the bone. So this totally is called osteoarthritis. So in simple terms, it is the wear and tear of the joint. Most commonly this occurs in weight bearing joints. So this can most people come with knee pains. So, and these people have mechanical pain. So they have pain only when they are standing for a long time or they are walking around. That kind of a pain is relieved by rest. In contrast, rheumatoid arthritis is an inflammatory arthritis. It causes pain predominantly involving the small joints. There is pain as soon as you wake up in the morning. Your joints are like swollen and it is very difficult to fold them. So they are stiff. So normally you might have seen now the climate is a little cold. So when you wake up in the morning, it's a little stiff. But our stiffness just wears out within 1 or 2 minutes of movement. Rheumatoid arthritis, in contrast, the stiffness may, on a criteria basis, needs to last for at least 30 to 45 minutes. But most patients say that, until the sun is high up in the sky, say about 10 o'clock, they cannot move. So they are the people who will tell you that it is difficult to get off their bed. They are not able to hold their toothbrush. They are not able to wash their face. So It's a real pain getting up in the morning and then going about your chores. Once movement starts, they are mildly better, but again, towards the end of the day, because there is, you go back to your sedentary thing, the pain flares. So in contrast to osteoarthritis, pain is mostly at rest. You wake up in the morning with this pain. There is a lot of stiffness and swelling that is associated, and there can be other features that are associated. So these people have a lot of fatigue, a lot of listlessness. They may lose appetite, they may lose weight, they may have fever, they may be associated anemia. And then there is something called as extra articular features, which are not related to arthritis or joints per se. So those can be development of nodules on the skin. Worst cases, they can have what is kind of called vasculitis, where can they develop long time chronic ulcers. They don't heal for many months. Then they can have involvement of nerves, which is called as mononeuritis multiplex, where they can suddenly find that there is weakness of one part of the body. So they can something be there. It's called a wrist drop. So suddenly this nerve goes damaged, and the nerve supply to this part of the body is gone. So the wrist drops, there is foot drop, many things like this. So there are extraarticular features that are associated with rheumatoid arthritis, not so commonly with osteo actually.
Gout being a lifestyle disorder, what is the real reason a person gets gout and what are the treatments for it?
So basically, there is a lot of misconception in the society that anytime anybody has high uric acid, they have gout. So I have patients who have come to me with a maybe uric acid of 9, 10, and they say, oh, namige vata ide. That's not true actually. Not everybody with hyperuricemia develops gout. So gout is when the uric acid crystals deposit, they reach a saturation in your blood, and then they have to deposit in the joints. So that deposition of those uric acid crystals in the joints causes inflammatory reaction there and causes intense pain. It's excruciating, with a lot of redness, lot of swelling, and stretching of the skin to an extent that it looks like really a shiny onion. Okay, and sometimes it can be so severe that there is peeling of the skin and things like that. But it is usually it comes in episodes. It doesn't last long. Basically about 3 to 4 days if you don't treat it as well. And it is easily treatable by NSAIDs, that is painkillers that are mainly called in society. But it is majorly, I think, at least now what we are seeing is that it is caused due to a sedentary lifestyle and lack of a good food habit. So anything with extreme high protein intake can precipitate gout. Lack of exercise, previous intake of alcohol, smoking can increase the chances of gout. Reduction in drinking water can precipitate gout, and sedentary lifestyle. So all these, and no incorporation of vegetables. So this can all lead to a tilting point where the body cannot manage the uric acid production anymore. So there are two ways. One is either your body is producing excess of uric acid, or it is not excreting enough uric acid. So that needs to be tested and treated. But gout can, apart from it being a lifestyle disorder, many people who are on certain drugs can develop gout. Many people who are undergoing cancer treatments, because we call it tumor lysis syndrome. So when the tumor undergoes lysis post radio or chemo, lot of proteins are suddenly released in the body, and it metabolizes to form a lot of uric acid. So because there's an overwhelming production, sometimes they develop gout. So there are other causes, and then gout can be hereditary. But most commonly, it used to be called the disease of kings, because only someone with a lavish lifestyle used to get it more often. So now everybody has a lavish lifestyle, so everybody gets it.
So what are some tips to prevent arthritis?
So these are much required, I think, in our generation currently, because we are so much into our phones and things. Our mobility has reduced massively. We do have many devices to keep count of our steps and all those things, but I don't think we have discipline. So one is some basic health discipline is an absolute must. So, good amount of sleep, about 6 to 8 hours of good continuous sleep, night sleep, because day sleep just ruins your circadian rhythm, and a lot of our hormones, a lot of our chemicals, a lot of body processes are attuned to that circadian rhythm. So, that itself can cause a lot of ups and downs and precipitate any kind of disease, not just arthritis. So, one is good amount of sleep. Second is, I think, food. Uh, Timely food, good balanced diet is an absolute requirement. So excess of protein, excess of carbs, excess of I really don't understand, whether it really helps us. Really, a balanced diet which is balanced in all proteins, carbs, fats, everything. None of them are not essential. They are all essential in their own ways. Good supplements with vegetables and fruits, because they are great sources of antioxidants, vitamins, and minerals. So that should be balanced. But I find that many people don't eat on time. Like, you have weird timings to eat. So that itself can cause stress inside the body. You may be tolerating it outside, but when we are young, we hardly make out. Your body just compensates for that for the longest time possible, and one day it says, I'm done. So up until then, you may not feel any change, but after that, you will have many, many changes. One of them is that it can cause a lot of internal stress, actually. Third is a good amount of exercise. So a lot of people have these short term goals ki I want to lose 5 kgs, I want to lose 10 kgs, so I will do this much, and then what? So I say, instead of losing weight, don't keep that as a goal, because that itself causes stress. You don't see any change on the weight scale, you think that you're not doing right. Do it so that you are fit. Don't do it because of weight loss or anything. So at least half an hour of any kind of workout that is suitable for your health status or your lifestyle, do that. So half an hour, we generally say 150 minutes in a week, so roughly that translates to 30 minutes for 5 days. So in patients with arthritis, when they ask us what kind of exercise, so I say generally it is swimming, which is the best, because it's non-weight bearing, toning, stretching, everything, and the pains reduce massively. It's a head to toe kind of an exercise, so that's awesome. Second is yoga, but yoga, certain postures do have limitations. So initially, at least when they are learning yoga, I would want them to have a trainer and then go ahead. Third, if you can't do anything, do walking. A good footwear, level ground, go for about half an hour. But anything else also, you can do aerobics, you can do Zumba, whatever, but do it according to your capacity. Just because someone else is doing for 45 minutes, 1 hour, you needn't have to push yourself. Start small, then go on adding to it, and see till where you can stretch your capacity. So the other, devoid of sedentary life, a good exercise is important. Then for people who are constantly working in offices and IT jobs and things like that, just take a break. Even housewives, for that matter, they want to just finish everything in one go. So they're either constantly standing or constantly sitting. Both of them are not good for your back and joints. So please get up once in 45 minutes to an hour, move around, come back. So what I commonly say is, how I link it is, I ask them to keep their water bottles really far away. So I would also insist on a water intake of about 2.5 to 3 liters every day. So make sure you're keeping your water bottle far away, so that you can give yourself the water breaks plus the mobility break, so that some parts of your body at least are able to stretch out, and you will also be mentally refreshed. The last thing I cannot stress enough about is, one is water, absolutely important, does wonders to your body. And last is stress. So if it can be handle and finish it off. Don't let it accumulate inside you in such a way that it can be causing you health issues. So if it is something that you can deal with, finish it off. If you can't deal with, please leave it to the Lord. Because unnecessary health problems, not just arthritis, but say hypertension, diabetes, heart issues, strokes, are all related to the extreme amount of stress. So now we are saying that our ICUs have patients who are younger and younger, coming for so many kind of stents and so many strokes, and it has massively increased in the last 10 years. You can blame COVID, you can blame the vaccine, no one wants to blame the lifestyle. So I feel that overall, when our lifestyle has become like these, the diseases are also bound to start early. Small changes in your life, that discipline, if you bring it, it should work wonders.
How do you detect arthritis in kids?
So, arthritis in kids is called as juvenile rheumatoid arthritis or juvenile connective tissue, whatever. So, juvenile is a term we use when the symptoms of arthritis develop before the age of 16. So, maybe when they are older and they can express themselves, it's easier to diagnose. But in really young kids, it's hard to detect because the only symptom might be that the child is not walking, or the child is absolutely not agreeing to be put down at all, or when you touch him also he will scream. So so the commonest other differential that we absolutely want to rule out in really young kids who come with joint pains is leukemias and lymphomas. So both are not nice to tell the parents about. A lot of stress is associated with it, but there are tests, there are many blood tests that can help us diagnose juvenile arthritis, and that can be treatable. So we may ask for a more invasive test like, say, bone marrow and things like that, just to be really sure that there is no lurking malignancy behind. But it can be, if you have a inkling that this might be this thing, you have many tests to diagnose arthritis in children.
And when it comes to leukemia,
Leukemia.
Yeah, how does that happen? And is it a hereditary thing?
Leukemias are mainly malignancies of the white blood cells. So there is sudden burst in the counts and things. So they are excessively produced in the bone marrow. So leukemias can occur sometimes because of hereditary, not really hereditary, certain gene mutations and things like that. I think oncologists will know better about it. But children can have, when they present with leukemias, they can have listlessness. So they can have sudden drop in hemoglobin, fatigue. They don't want to wake up at all. They're very, and any part of them that we handle, it's very painful for them. Then joint pains can occur, high fevers, and bruising can occur. Basically, you see that there is a lot of sudden non-traumatic bruising that is occurring, which should help us to think that it is leukemia. So between, say, juvenile arthritis and leukemia, certain pointers are, one is this bruising and all, and the other thing is that there might be internal organ enlargement of the liver and the spleen in leukemia, which is not commonly found in juvenile rheumatoids.
When it comes to arthritis, there is a term called as soft tissue rheumatism. Could you explain about that?
So I find that we have more and more patients of soft tissue rheumatism these days than just general hardcore rheumatology, and I would associate that with stress. So any structure that is supporting the say skeleton are called soft tissue. So basically our muscles, our ligaments, our tendons, so all these are soft tissues. And acute chronic pain, acute or chronic pain that causes a long time discomfort is called soft tissue rheumatism. So one of the most, so you can have, say, just shoulder pain, you can have just cervical spondylitis, you can have lower back pains that are chronic. So these people won't have major limitation in their work, but they are always working with pain, they are always aching, and they are never really happy. One of the most commonest of those are what is called as fibromyalgia. So fibromyalgia doesn't have to do anything with the autoimmune disease, but it is basically that your muscle goes into a lot of what should I say, in the most colloquial terms, it is muscle goes into knots. So, and these people have extreme pain even when you put a little pressure. So even when we are checking BP, they wince with pain. So these things are the commonest things that we see in soft tissue rheumatism. The greater the stress, the more tendency to develop it if we are not handling it the right way. And some rheumatological conditions also can be associated with it. So that's what it is about.
What is hip replacement done, and when is it done actually?
So in rheumatology per se. Hip replacement is when we find that, a patient has, say, a long-term disease, and that has gone into a degenerative phase where the surfaces of the hip, uh, basically the pelvic bone and the surface of the femur, have either uh, stuck together in such a way that mobility is not possible. Either they are limping, or it is fixed and they are wheelchair bound, or we find that because of this chronic deformity and disease and damage to that joint, it is just pushing inside. So that can lead to hip replacements in rheumatology. Apart from this, long term rheumatological diseases and, say, postmenopausal women have osteoporosis. So they can have sudden fractures also of the hip where, we may need to do a partial or a total hip replacement. Also, that we talked about juvenile rheumatoids. So patients with juvenile rheumatoid arthritis, because they have a long-term disease, can go in for early hip replacements if treatment has not been taken adequately. So if normally in osteoarthritis we suggest a hip or knee replacement over the age of, say, 55, 60, in juvenile we may have to suggest it even at around 35, 40. So that early, but that massively improves their mobility and helps them live a near normal life. So that is advisable to some of our patients, not all.
What are the side effects seen when a hip replacement surgery is actually done?
So I feel that with hip replacement, the commonest thing is that patients are really worried that they don't exercise well. So after immediate replacements, our orthopedic surgeons make immensely sure that they are mobile before they leave the hospital. But that physiotherapy needs to continue, and you have to, just because we have replaced the hip, the the joint that was damaged, does not mean that the disease is off. So patients who have rheumatoid arthritis or any other rheumatological conditions, having gone for a replacement, does not mean that you have to stop medicine. So you have to continue medicines later as suggested, and continue physiotherapy so that there is muscle bulking. And when the muscles are toned and bulked up, they are able to, support your joint better, your posture becomes better. Otherwise, the commonest ones are, I think, to do with infections, because our patients are immunosuppressed. Our medicines suppress this autoimmune activity, so they are suppressing the immune system, slightly more prone to developing infections. So one is that. There can be suture related complications and things like that, but I find those complications are really, really less now. Very rare complications are like, there can be embolism, or there can be what is called as DVTs, thrombus, etc., but they are very, very rare in the hands of a good surgeon actually.
How long does it take for a normal person to recover, and what are the precautions to be taken during that time?
During the hip replacement,
Yes.
so I feel 15 days. So you might have to stay in the hospital, say, about for 5 days, where you're mobilized and slowly you're taught how to bear weight again on your new hips. So once you're discharged, like 15-20 days of physiotherapy, they will continuously do it, and those exercises you're supposed to do. Some support while walking with use of, say, walkers and things will be required in the long run. Say, maybe it depends upon your age as well. So I find younger people recover faster because their muscles are already a little better. With age, that recovery might be a little more. So anywhere between 15 to 30 days. The care that they have to take is that, one is mentally prepare themselves that people think that as soon as replacement occurs, they will be back to normal. Anything in the body takes time. It's like, if you want a mango today, you would have to plant it about 20 years back. So similarly, if you have had a hip replacement today, just wait for about 2-3 months till you come back to your normal. Give yourself and your body that much amount of time to recuperate. uh, Basically work on that physiotherapy and rehab, whatever has been suggested. Some patients will need extra supplements apart from calcium to improve your bone density. So we find that with arthritis, with aging, the bone density goes on decreasing. This is called as osteoporosis. So osteoporosis makes your bones really brittle and they can easily break. So like I already said, one of the commonest indications for our surgeries and everything is this thing, osteoporotic fractures. Similarly, once the surgery is done, patients will have to take injections or as suggested by your doctor to improve that bone density. So these can be taken over a duration of say 6 months or many years. So those supplements might be required. So heed to your doctor's advice and make sure that you are taking them regularly. And some care, like generally when you're doing your routine activities also, like I said, don't try to do it continuously. Sitting in the same position or standing in the same position for a very long time is to be avoided. So such minute cares just need to be taken, that's all.
When talking about autoimmune disease in a country like India, which are the common ones, and could you explain us about the autoimmune diseases?
So one of the most common autoimmune diseases that we deal with is, I think, rheumatoid arthritis. So rheumatoid arthritis, say, affects about women 2 to 3 times more than it affects men, and occurs in the age anywhere between about say 20 to 40. So this is the childbearing group actually that has this disease. It can occur later, it can occur earlier. It's not like it has to occur in this age frame itself. So patients usually have uh, small joint pains with swelling, stiffness, and redness, warmth over these small joints, with difficulty to fold at all. And then there are other symptoms. Large joints, of course, can be totally affected. So we have had patients who have come to us in wheelchairs or they are bedbound because of immobility following this arthritis. So it the thing is that it is so easy to diagnose, and with certain lab tests you can make the diagnosis even in say 1 hour. The patient has to spend only about an hour with us and we'll start them on treatment. It takes time to get better, but that's okay. Then there are other rheumatological diseases such as connective tissue disorder. So we talked about something called as lupus. Lupus is actually called as systemic lupus erythematosus. So lupus is something that is can be a all rheumatological diseases can be a multi-organ disease, but lupus especially we are worried about because it can go for very important organs such as the kidneys and the brain as well. So we call it lupus nephritis when it involves the kidneys, or neuropsychiatric SLE, where it can cause neurological or psychiatric manifestations in lupus. Both need to be attended to immediately. Like we can't wait thinking, giving small drugs wondering that it'll get okay. So you have to attack with your best that is available to you at that particular time and then follow up. So the recognition is actually more important. Earlier diagnosis can make the treatment much better, prognosis much better, and we can improve the patient life also much better. So among that category, there are other diseases called, say, scleroderma. So scleroderma is more of a colloquial term. It is actually called a systemic sclerosis. So systemic sclerosis generally goes for the skin. So what happens is there is our skin is normally elastic. You can easily pinch your skin. But in scleroderma, progressively what happens is the skin starts to get tightened so much that they can't fold at all. So this usually starts in the peripheries, expanding to your proximal part of the lung of the trunk, and can involve the face. So when it starts to involve the face, the normal facial creases are gone, their mouth opening becomes limited. There might be a sudden change in skin color. So they will have a face where it becomes suddenly hyperpigmented, they become suddenly dark. Then there might be multiple white spots that are appearing on multiple your hands maybe and nape of the neck. So these are the commonest. And also they are very temperature sensitive. So all of us, when we go to the Himalayas, we suddenly get this bluish tips. Okay, but for them this can happen in Mangalore weather also. So if they put their hands into say cold water or sit in the AC for too long, the digital tips can suddenly turn blue. This is called as Raynaud's phenomena. So in some people it might be completely harmless, But in people with scleroderma, it doesn't normalize very fast like it does in us, and that persistent Raynaud's can lead to gangrene of the digits. So suddenly there can be blackish discoloration of the tips of the digits. So that can happen with this particular disease. But again, the internal organ involvement is in the lungs. So we get something called as interstitial lung disease, which is very common with scleroderma, is with the heart, where we get what is called as pulmonary arterial hypertension. So those are need to be looked into, identified early, and treated fast. So that is one. Then another one which is very interesting is, I think, Sjogren syndrome. This autoimmune disease goes for your exocrine glands, the glands which are secreting something. So commonly goes for our tear glands, which are called as the lacrimals, or our salivary glands. So what happens is these people don't develop tears. So you know the importance of tears only in a patient with Sjogren's. The eye is absolutely dry, and it hurts. It's irritating. They always feel like there is some kind of sand in their eye. They have to keep rubbing it. The problem is that when you do this, it becomes dry. Tear films are actually naturally protective to our eye. So when that is not there, you're not just prone to the atmospheric dryness. You're prone to rubbing it and getting a lot of scratches on your cornea also. We can get keratitis, we can get conjunctivitis, recurrent infections, etc. And the other thing is that you don't get saliva. So when you don't get saliva, it's very hard to chew, to eat, and also to talk. So people cannot talk continuously for half an hour, 45 minutes. They can't do it. So apart from these two organs, what that goes for is usually the kidney or this thing. So what happens is our kidneys are naturally trying to conserve potassium in our body. In Sjogren's, there is something called as distal renal tubular acidosis, which can cause loss of potassium. So this excessive loss of potassium can cause quadriparesis. So they will be suddenly paralyzed neck down. It can be, if identified immediately, it can be treated with the potassium replacements. But if you don't identify the Sjogren's behind it, it will keep happening. So you can imagine the life of this person. They keep developing this hypokalemic periodic paralysis, and it is very stressful because if not treated in time, they can go in for respiratory distress and die. So basically all of them are like whatever I'm describing so far. You might have seen a pattern. None of them have they may have overlapping features when it's called an overlap syndrome, but all of them are kind of significantly targeting certain organ systems, certain or this like skin or kidney or hair or eyes or whatever. That helps us to diagnose what it is apart from the investigations that we do.
What are the tips to prevent the autoimmune diseases?
Very hard actually. So you can't really completely prevent autoimmune diseases, but you can modify your response to them. So I feel apart from the 5 things we've already discussed, that is sleep, food intake, water intake, exercise, and stress. Apart from managing these 5, commonly other environmental stress, suppose excessive exposure to the sun, lot of recurrent infections, all these can modify your immune response in a way that can make you prone to developing certain autoimmune diseases. So lupus like diseases, all connective disorders, are associated with increased exposure to sun. So we absolutely tell everybody, not just patients with rheumatological diseases, to use sunscreens regularly. Now that the ozone is also depleting, our exposure to the harmful radiations of the sun are more. So the disease causing thing is more. I wouldn't say sun is harmful, sun is life giving, but with a pinch of salt. So just apply sunscreen regularly. You can't avoid infections. See, there was a wave of COVID like just changed our lives so much, but we found that after COVID, more and more people were coming with rheumatological diseases. So it basically dysregulates your immune system in some way. So what you can do is, if you do something to remain fit and healthy, if that becomes your goal, your body's response to infections also changes. So the way it handles infections changes. So sometimes what it does is, either it completely protects you from infections, or if you do get infections, it doesn't dysregulate. It dysregulates for a while and then just comes back also. So I feel these things are the commonest things that you can do to prevent autoimmune diseases. But if it does come, don't get disheartened.
Just take the right treatment at the
Correct.
right time. So, when it comes to rheumatic conditions, is it a hereditary disease or is it more related to the environmental and the lifestyle diseases?
So I would say it's a combination of both. So most rheumatological diseases, what need is, they need a double hit. So just one cause, I don't think, is enough to cause rheumatological diseases. We can find certain diseases, like suppose when I was talking about spondyloarthropathy. So spondyloarthropathies can sometimes be hereditary. Psoriatic arthritis, psoriasis can be hereditary. So in this set of diseases, we ask actively for family history because it aids in our diagnosis. It helps us to make out the right direction, if we are going in the right direction, and asking for the right kind of tests also. But other conditions such as lupus and say rheumatoid arthritis also can be hereditary. And but it does not mean that if someone in your family has some kind of an arthritis, you have to develop it. Not necessary. You're at a risk of it. But if you take care, probably you can either delay it or avoid it completely. That is one. But usually, even if you have a hereditary predisposition to developing certain autoimmune diseases, a second hit is usually required. And this second hit in ladies comes in the form of hormonal imbalances, pregnancy, lactation, recurrent pregnancies. So in ladies it can be this. In the general population it can be in the form of trauma. It can be surgical traumas or accidents, because it's a lot of stress for the body. So some of our patients come after a major cardiac surgery, that they have suddenly developed all kinds of joint pains. So then we figure that it might be this. Then it can be, like you said, environmental factors such as infections. Third can be like, a vacation. So suddenly when they have exposed themselves to a lot of sun. I had a patient who had been to vacation in Dubai, I guess, and she was on the beach for the longest time, I guess, as she was sunbathing. By the time she came back to India, she had developed dermatomyositis, which is a kind of myositis. So it can actually aggravate the thing, but it need not have to cause it totally. That is the whole thing.
So, could you debunk some myths about the arthritis?
Myths about arthritis. So a lot of people think that uh, arthritis is hereditary. It may not be. Two is, a lot of people think that arthritis is curable. Majority of them are not curable, they are treatable. And when you treat them on the long run, the risk of complications, or uh, the benefit of us having to just remove the drugs is higher if you treat it earlier and better rather than later. People think that all arthritic diseases are treated only by steroids. That is our major this thing. Yes, we do use steroids. I think we are one of the highest users of steroids. Steroid is a good drug, but when it is given in the right quantities by the right person who knows what to look for, how to de-escalate or escalate it, it is a wonderful drug. People taking it over the counter, yes, of course it is not great. So not all arthritis need to be treated by steroids. People think that all medicines that uh, we give in arthritis causes renal diseases, or it causes kidney failure because they are painkillers. No, the treatment that we give in arthritis is not painkillers. They will reduce your pain, but they are not the colloquial painkillers as such. They are the drugs that will modify your immune system in such a way that it does not increase your autoimmunity, but it is not something that will they are not NSAIDs basically. Then they think that you have to come to us every month. The most common thing is, do I have to come every month? So I say no. You have to come. If I have diagnosed you today, maybe we'll have to see you on a monthly basis for about next 2-3 months till we are set with this treatment suits you. Then it's okay. Then you can, if you're in good, the disease activity has come down, you have responded excellently to the treatment, I will need to see you only once in 3 months or 6 months. So these are the commonest things. Other things are that the patients with arthritis, suppose there are two patients with rheumatoid in the same family. Can you exchange your medicines? No, you can't exchange your medicines. So treatment is very specific to how one's body responds to this thing. So I don't think you can exchange pills like you can exchange tiffin boxes, unfortunately, but that's that.
So, in your experience, what are the most memorable cases that you've treated?
uh, so I think there would be a few which are really good, but they've done wonderfully well and they have been doing great, but there are some that we could not save along the line. I think two of them I would remember. One is a patient I've been seeing in Udupi. So she had rheumatoid arthritis for the longest time, and I think about 10 years. So when I saw her at the age of 29, she had been only taking some kind of Ayurvedic treatments, on and off English medicine, but with no real relief. And there was this myth in her head because some neighbor or I don't know who told her that people with arthritis cannot marry and cannot have kids. And she was distressed by this fact actually. So I think when we're treating any autoimmune diseases or any other diseases, partly you are also treating the psychology of the patient, wondering what is going on in their head. So she was really distressed by this factor. This was adding to her arthritis. So once treatment was initiated, actually within, her response was really good. About in 2-3 months of initiating the proper kind of treatment, she became excellently well, which is when I brought up the topic of marriage and I said, see, you can definitely marry. Only when you're planning a pregnancy, do let me know, because I will give you medicines that are safer for preconception, for conception, and during breastfeeding. So your rheumatoid will, at least I will try my best that your rheumatoid does not flare during these periods and it does not cause you any problem. Uh, Thankfully, she had a lot of trust in me. She got married, she had a kid, and she even comes now with that kid saying every time that if you hadn't given me that faith that I could marry and I could have kids, I would have absolutely been alone all my life. And that debunking that myth uh, basically helped her so much. I see her radiant and smiling all the time. So that was the it's very gratifying actually to be able to make that much of a difference in somebody's life. The other patient is one of my favorite patients. She is no more, but hers was one of the most complicated things I have ever handled in, I think, my practice. She had systemic lupus erythematosus, and but she had also something called as APLA. So APLA is antiphospholipid antibody syndrome. This particular autoimmune disease makes your blood clot inside your body at its at its will. So normally our body is a wonderful machine. So it only responds to, basically with the terms of blood clotting, only to trauma. So when there is an injury, it will clot. But in APLA, what happens is this response dysregulates. It can clot just about anywhere. So you can imagine that the organ involvement is basically on wherever that blood decides to clot. So although she was on treatment, she was regular, she was a nurse by occupation, but she had to chuck it because she could not manage both the things. Her marital life was under complete discord because she was always having to take treatment and the husband's family wouldn't support it, so she had come back. Lot of stressful factors. So one fine day she landed up in the hospital with a stroke, and then she developed drop in platelet counts. Then she developed what is called as proteinuria. Her kidney was suddenly throwing out a lot of protein. along with blood, which is called as nephritis, and she developed a gangrene. So when this happens, like 3 areas you get clots, evidence that there is a clot. This is called as catastrophic APLA. It is fatal in about 70 to 75% of patients. So it was one of the most difficult periods of her life and my life, because we really did not know whether what we are doing is enough. They were financially constrained, but they tried to manage with everything. We tried to manage with everything. She was in the hospital for about 20-25 days, about 10 to 15 days of ICU. She got out of it, but she later on succumbed to the much, I think about 2 years later. She had to go on dialysis and stuff because of this chronic nephritis. But I always think of her because she was a real fighter. She did everything in her hands. Her parents were really supportive, and she kept a positive outlook always. But life had different plans, so.
Definitely. Yeah. So coming to technology, how has the treatment changed with the technology, especially coming to wearable devices?
So, use of devices in rheumatology, I think, is a lot less actually. But in like now, more and more of our musculoskeletal ultrasound are used for either early diagnosis, for better diagnosis, to determine if the patient's disease activity is less, etc. Then we have AI coming up in a big way to tell us about how we can, tailor the treatment of the patient and things like that. And of course, then there are many splints, many other kind of devices that are available to help in mobility and restriction of deformity formation. But I think that's how it has been coming up. There is a lot of scope for it in the future.
Could you explain the connection between fatigue and rheumatology?
So basically, patients with all rheumatological disorders have intense fatigue, and that fatigue can be two ways. One is because these patients to an extent have anorexia also. They have a loss of appetite, so their intake is massively less. And because rheumatological illness, or say autoimmunity, is kind of a catabolic state. So there is a lot of loss of muscles, and fat stores are anyway gone, but muscle loss is also there, which can add to your fatigue. So I think in rheumatology, the difference in generalized fatigue that can occur with, say, soft tissue rheumatisms, that can occur with autoimmune diseases, should be differentiated from very specific muscle fatigue or muscle weakness. So that may be associated with, say, myositis. So that will be different, that is treated different. But this generalized fatigue can be treated with just onset of treatment of rheumatological drugs itself. The fatigue also naturally improves over the time.
So when we say myositis, we have our famous actor Samantha Prabhu suffering from it. So how does one get diagnosed with it, and what is the initial treatment that they should approach?
So myositis is not a very well-known autoimmune disease, though, because it's not very commonly found, and it's kind of rare. But I think Samantha really put this out in the world that there can be something like this. So myositis is basically the inflammation of muscle. So when we said arthritis, we said inflammation of the joints. Myositis has to do with muscle inflammation, which causes progressive weakness of those muscles. So suddenly the patient will notice that they are not able to, say, get up from sitting position, take stairs, and progressively this will lead to them not being able to turn in their beds or get up and sit by themselves from a lying down position also. Then when it is involving the upper limbs, basically they cannot even comb their hair, they cannot brush their teeth, they cannot grab something from a top shelf and things like that. So these are the early symptoms. So this can progress to involve more and more muscle domains, and can cause more and more weakness. The worst thing is when it involves the respiratory muscles, it can cause respiratory arrest, leading, when it is really acute, our patients sometimes need to go on ventilators. So that is how myositis is. So myositis Commonly, the ones that we see are called as dermatomyositis, polymyositis, inclusion body myositis, necrotizing myositis, many. So they can be associated with skin rashes, they can be associated with joint pains. So, like I said, many overlapping features will be there, and again, they can have sometimes involve also lung. Basically, it can cause interstitial lung disease as well. So that is myositis. So what kind you have, and what how is the treatment has to be determined. The easiest way probably to diagnose myositis is to do liver function test and to do creatine phosphokinase, which is called as CPK. It's a muscle enzyme, and usually people with myositis have this in thousands, while the normal range is anywhere between, say, about 60 to 300. When it is in thousands, then it naturally gives us a clue. Apart from that, on clinical examination, patient will have extreme muscle pain, muscles are tender, they may be swollen, and things can be easily diagnosed by MRI and EMG. Apart from that, the gold standard is a muscle biopsy.
And when it comes to differentiating between a normal body pain, how should an individual differentiate a normal joint pain and a joint pain related to arthritis or rheumatology?
I think that's a good question, because some people in rheumatology have only, intermittent symptoms. So they're not symptomatic all the time. So in such people, it is really difficult to find whether this is normal or this is something related to rheumatology. So I feel if the pains are persistent and if they are, limiting your movement, causing a lot of swelling and stiffness, associated with weight loss, and associated with any other symptoms like, say, fever, rash, oral ulcers, excessive hair fall, muscle weaknesses, etc., do not hesitate to come and get a test. It's pretty simple to differentiate actually. So do not sit thinking that, oh, this is going to go away, this is going to go away. So if it's been there for over 2-3 weeks, do take medical attention for it.
What are the tests used to determine the rheumatic diseases?
So commonly when we see a patient initially, we get all the basic tests done, which is hemograms, their liver and kidney function test and everything. But the most important indicator is what are called as inflammatory markers. So these are ESR and CRP, and they give us a clue that, okay, there is something going on inside. However, ESR and CRP can be completely elevated in infections, in malignancies also. But then, of course, you have to just associate it with the kind of symptoms the patient also has. So apart from this, we have very specific tests, say like rheumatoid factor is kind of very well known. It is not specific to diagnosis of rheumatoid arthritis, but it is pretty sensitive. A lot of people come back with a lot of positive values. So rheumatoid factor, then we have something called as anti-CCP, which is also to diagnose rheumatoid arthritis. And to diagnose, say, connective tissue disorders, we have other tests such as anti-nuclear antibodies. So these detects ANAs and then specific antigens that are related to these ANAs. For APLA, like I said, there are specific antibodies. So based on what symptoms they are coming with, we order those kind of tests. So even though your tests might be sometimes negative, it does not completely, say that there may be no rheumatological disease. So if you feel that the ANA is negative or the ANCAs are negative, whatever, there are some other ways to determine it. So there are seronegative versions of all rheumatological diseases also. So based on the patient's symptom and how the inflammatory burden is and what tests we have ordered, sometimes we need radiology, so we need x-rays, we need MRI. So all of these put together helps us in diagnosing a particular rheumatological disease.
Which is the best diet for a patient having rheumatology?
I think the best thing is to switch to vegetarian ever, I think, because it's very, very rich in antioxidants and vitamins and minerals, and predominantly it's an anti-inflammatory diet. However, I wouldn't shy away from fish also. So fish has a lot of DHAs, a lot of omegas, which can improve your diet, which can improve your health in general. and also prevent basically excessive flares in rheumatological diseases. Eggs are a great source of protein, so egg whites are great. Among the non-vegetarian, I mean, of course, these are there, but apart from them, chicken and meat is something I would like my patients to avoid, because they may add the inflammatory burden. And also, if they want to eat any of this, I mean, whether it's vegetables or non-vegetarian food, I would ask them to have it in curries or in this thing. I mean, deep fried and outside food, junk food, all these are to be avoided ideally. Cold items are to be avoided. Once in a while is okay, but too much of cold water, and you're constantly taking cold curd, cold milk, all this I think should be avoided. So I think if they switch to this kind, incorporate a lot of greens in your diet, lot of vegetables, lot of fruits, dry fruits, make it a regular habit. And if that is incorporated, once in a while eating other things will probably not be harmful.
So, do factors like stress and the toxic environment that we are in actually add on to the rheumatology diseases to, spike up really fast?
Yes, I think definitely does. Currently, we are living in a really stressful environment. So even if we are not doing anything, we feel that stress. So stress, I feel, is kind of like ghee into what ghee does to any Havana, stress does to rheumatological diseases. So no matter how much of medicines are given, even steroids are given or biologicals are given, sometimes disease may not come under good control because of this constant stress. Stress can be of many varieties. So it can be physical stress, it can be mental, it can be psychological, it can be emotional. So all this adds on to that disease burden and can keep precipitating or flaring the disease even on optimum treatment. In which case then we'll have to address it. So there are many other medications that we also add on sometimes as a co-prescription onto our rheumatological drugs, which help us to control it. If we feel that it is just going way beyond and causing recurrent flares, and the flares are because of stress, then we definitely ask them to go on these drugs as well. It helps.
So, when coming to biological therapies, which are the best candidates which can take these treatment?
So biologics are basically very good drugs, but they are like whatever normally we give in as DMRs, the what are called as disease modifying anti-rheumatoid drugs, are majoritively they are like a carpet therapy. So they basically all the autoimmune factors, all the cells and all the cytokines that are being produced in the body are kind of nullified by this carpet therapy. Biologicals are like missiles, so they are very targeted. They target one kind of chemical or autoantibody in our body, a cell population. So that is how they work. So targeted therapies are basically indicated when our routine, one or two DMRs we have used for over 3 months, and we find that the disease activity is still really high, is when we ask them to take more of these biologics. Alternatively, even on the first consult, if you come to me with an extra-articular disease, it has been there for a really long time, many people have seen, and it's not come under control, maybe I will say take a biologic, because there's nothing else left to do there. So if they're coming with acute extra-articular disease, they have lung disease, they have say vasculitis, they have anything of these sorts, nephritis and lupus, NPSLE. So all these patients I would suggest to take injectable therapies, which can be DMRs or can be biologics in some cases. Patients who are planning pregnancy, and I need that their disease activity needs to be really controlled pre-conception, conception and post-conception, because that time period is very crucial for us. It is stressful for the ladies. They have a lot of work. The body is demanding too much of them at that point of time. So a lot of hormonal changes. So they are prone to getting flares sometimes. Although most arthritises do not flare during pregnancy because of these hormonal changes. Sometimes they do. We want it to be at the base minimum, not troubling her at all. So in such patients, sometimes we do advise to take certain biologics so that the disease activity during the time of pregnancy at least does not flare. But that time gap has to be, you have to curate it in such a way that there is a solid about 3 to 4 months gap between us taking a biologic and the patient conceiving even. However, some patients have really terrible flares during pregnancy. Certain biologics can be safe in pregnancy, so they can be given even during pregnancy.
So in 2015, we see that Selena Gomez, she developed something called lupus. So could you explain how is that related to kidney transplant later?
So Selena actually, like Samantha put myositis on the map, Selena put lupus on the map. It became really well known after she developed it. Lupus is not a great disease to handle. It's not great disease to have, is not a great disease to handle. But it can go for many organ systems, and one of the major organ system it goes for is kidney. So the thing is, the kidney, once it's attacked, it keeps on losing proteins and develops into, I mean, when it's not treated adequately, it goes into glomerulonephritis and may develop what is called as end stage renal disease. This is the natural progression of a lupus kidney. So although we have excellent therapies for it, like all the biologics that we have talked about, and there are some other injectable therapies that are given, they can retard the progression of those diseases, but they can never completely cure it completely. So if based on renal biopsies we know that the kidney has already reached a certain stage of nephritis, renal replacement therapy really is great, because you're getting one new kidney which is not diseased yet, and you can the harmful effects of that renal disease on your body is much less. However, even after renal transplant you may have to be on immune drugs so that that kidney is not affected as much.
So when we talk about rheumatic diseases, how do they actually affect the internal organs of the body?
So rheumatological diseases are organ specific sometimes. So they can, some rheumatological diseases have uh, inclination to certain organs. So lupus, like I said, has an inclination majority to the kidneys, but it can include the brain. It can have effect on the skin. That is basically, it can cause vasculitis and things like this. Apart from this, it can lead to recurrent gangrenes. Other connective tissue disorders can have effect on the lungs, which is called as interstitial lung disease. So that can occur even in rheumatoid. So basically, we when we diagnose a particular rheumatological condition, we also keep looking and monitoring if the other organs are getting involved, knowing that this is what they have and this is what they can have. So that is how we go on monitoring. If we catch them early, we can treat them better.
What is the connection between psoriasis and arthritis?
So this is a really good question. So because a lot of patients who have psoriasis don't know that they can have psoriatic arthritis as well. So psoriatic arthritis is preceded by psoriasis in about 80 to 90% of the patients. But in those 10% of patients, psoriatic arthritis is the first one to come, and they develop psoriasis later. So they come under the umbrella term of what is known as seronegative arthritis. So in such patients, if you do routine tests, although their inflammatory parameters are really high, their rheumatoid factor, anti-CCP, ANA, all these tests that we had mentioned before might be totally negative. So the diagnosis is on the determination of presence of skin lesions, presence of nail disease, presence of what is called as dactylitis. So in psoriatic arthritis, you can have the entire finger completely swollen like a sausage. So it's called a sausage digit, and that is diagnostic. And you need your dermatology counterpart to help you in determining whether it is actually psoriasis or something else, and family history. So any family history of psoriasis aids in the diagnosis of psoriatic arthritis. So patients with psoriasis, whether it is really small areas or large areas, should absolutely get treated. So when we treat psoriasis adequately, the risk of developing arthritis is lesser. We can't totally prevent it, but lesser.
So, when it comes to hereditary disease, what are the most common hereditary diseases that you've seen in the rheumatic conditions?
So I think one of them is this: the seronegative spondyloarthropathies are related to gene allele called HLA-B27. So there are families that have HLA-B27 running in the heredity, and these patients can develop seronegative arthritis. So one of them, strongly linked to HLA-B27, is called ankylosing spondylitis. So this disease basically goes for the spine. So it's called axial spondyloarthropathy, where it makes the patient, these are very young males. So we had discussed that most rheumatological diseases are common in females. This particular set is more common in males, very less in females. So males carrying this HLA-B27 can sometimes develop intermittent inflammatory back pain, which is predominantly present at rest, associated with the early morning or rest associated stiffness of about 45 minutes, and which always gets better with activity. They can also have predominant large joint involvement, and then there are overlaps. So they can have associated psoriasis, they can have associated what is known as inflammatory bowel diseases. So, and undifferentiated also. There are many, and they can have what is called as enthesitis. So, enthesis is the area where our tendon joins our bone. So inflammation of that is called enthesitis, and enthesitis is most frequently found in this category of diseases. So this is the one of the most commonest hereditarily linked, but it does not mean that if you don't have HLA-B27 you don't have ankylosing spondylitis. Again, it is, the diagnosis is based on many factors put together, not just one particular test, but the commonest is HLA-B27, I guess.
Is it better to have a thalassemia test done before marriage?
Definitely. So I would rather suggest that you have a nice gene mapping test, especially for thalassemia and things, rather than sometimes have our jatakas matched. So I think it's always just better to have a good, if there are certain genetic conditions in the family, to be open about them, to discuss it beforehand. And for things like thalassemia, definitely to have a test before and see if there is a risk of the child being born with thalassemia major or something.
What are some of the message that you want our youngsters to take and adopt in their life seriously?
One of the most important things is, I think, please reduce your screen time. I think we are wasting a lot of time on the mobile, and we are not doing what is important by us. So not just our physical and mental health, even by our families sometimes. So good amount of exercise, good amount of indulging in your hobbies, having a creative side can actually reduce the intensity of any disease. So like we discussed, stress always increases any disease, whether it is metabolic diseases or hereditary diseases or say rheumatological diseases. But the thing is that if you have some regular lifestyle, you have a good amount of hobbies that you can lean on, that stress can get dissipated, I feel. So build your go out, interact, be socially available, learn something new, like we used to do in the olden times, not online maybe, but because that is available to you actually. That is the most important thing. Avoid a sedentary lifestyle. Don't hook on yourself to the Swiggy Zomato culture. So things have become so easy for us that we just order everything. Please think before you order anything, because you really don't know where that food is coming from. What is the quality of the ingredients that they have used? What is the oil that they've used? Is there any kind of what are the kind of preservatives they have used and they're mixing? And you don't know any of this. Just because it's tasty or it's easy, don't compromise on your health. I think in this era is like the biggest gift you can get. Third thing is, once you start earning, please invest in medical insurances. A lot of people don't do that. One of the first things I tell one of my most of my patients is to at least get small insurances and keep, because health costs in our world are escalating more than the value of, say, gold or land. And even if you have gold or land or whatever bank balance, uh, with a catastrophic disease, the health cost will be anywhere between 10-15 lakhs, and that might be very difficult to handle at that moment. Insurances, in whatever small way, can definitely help, and I feel some small security is required. I wouldn't place insurance over improving your health, but it is important. I think these three things.
I hope you all enjoyed today's podcast. Until next time, bye bye and take care.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching this episode. I hope you all found some interesting tips for yourself. If you found this video helpful, do share it to someone who needs to hear this. Also, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Until next time, do take care of your health. Bye bye.